Namaskar, this is Firstpost and you're watching Vantage with me, Palki Sharma. India's economy is the global bright spot, the fastest growing in the world. The UK is among the worst. The IMF has come up with new projections. We'll tell you what they've said and why India is faring better than others. In Europe, Emmanuel Macron is being heckled. He was shouted down during a speech. His comments on China and Taiwan have kicked up quite a storm. Meanwhile, Beijing has a new visitor, Brazil's President Lula da Silva. What's he doing there and why should the world care? We'll tell you. In Myanmar, the military has claimed responsibility for killing 100 civilians in airstrikes. In Kenya, they don't have the money to pay salaries of government servants. In Ukraine, a change of heart. They want to be friends with India now. Zelensky wants Indian aid and a speech at the G20. What about the moral lectures to India for buying Russian oil? Kiev says it is in no position to instruct India. It's quite a U-turn. We'll talk about it. And Super Mario Brothers is smashing the box office. You don't want to miss this report. The headlines first. More tension in the Taiwan Straits. After sending warships and jets, China will impose a no-fly zone north of Taiwan next week. Beijing says this is for space activities. Violent clashes in Ethiopia's Amhara region. Several people have been shot as protests continue for the sixth day. Protesters are angry with the federal government for disbanding regional forces. The next step in the Saudi-Iran truce. A delegation from Iran visits Riyadh after a Saudi team came to Tehran. They're reopening diplomatic missions after 7 years of tension. Bomb scare in India's capital city. A school in Delhi was evacuated after it received a bomb threat. Police say the email threat appears to be a hoax. The school received a similar threat last year too. And is Tupperware going out of business? The household name could soon be history. The maker of plastic containers is battling rising debts and falling demand. Its shares plunged by nearly 50% on Monday. Tonight we start with the economy. There's good news and bad news. The bad news is that global growth is slowing down. The good news is it's not as bad as the world feared. And the best news is that India remains the bright spot. A new assessment has come out. It's from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. It has slashed the global growth outlook. The forecast for leading economies looks grim. The UK is among the worst performing. Their economy is shrinking. In Germany, there may be a recession, but India remains strong. The IMF has a lot to say about India. In fact, let me quote from what one official said. Yes, we have a growth rate for India, which is 6.8 in 2022. Let's not forget, this is one of the bright spots in the global economy right now. So what is India's growth forecast this time? 5.9%. The IMF says the Indian economy will grow by 5.9%. And this is a downgrade compared to the last assessment. The last one came in the month of January. That was 3 months back. Then the IMF said that India will grow at a rate of 6.1%. So in these 3 months, the forecast for India has been slashed by 0.2%. And yet, India remains the fastest growing economy in the world. Listen to this.
What's happening here is also a set of historical revisions. We realized that 2021 has been actually a lot better than we thought. And so actually there's less room for catching up. And that pent-up demand, which from consumption that was informing our previous forecast is therefore going to be less because they've already had more catching up before. So that's why there's the downward revision this year. Then we go up to 6.3 next year. Again, a very strong economy, which is necessary to allow India to continue to converge towards higher living standards and create those jobs.
So 5.9% growth this year and 6.3% in the next financial year. That's the growth trajectory for India according to the IMF. It's lower than India's own growth forecast, but it's pretty solid when you look at the rest of the world. According to the IMF, the United States will grow at a rate of 1.6%. The Eurozone, 0.8%. Eurozone has 19 countries which use the euro as their currency. Russia's growth is projected to be 0.7% despite the war and the Western sanctions. China 5.2% and India 5.9%. So India comes on top of this list. Why do you think India is doing better? The World Bank has an assessment. This came out earlier this month. And here is what the World Bank said about India. I'm quoting again. The Indian economy continues to show strong resilience to external shocks. Notwithstanding external pressures, India's service exports have continued to increase and the current account deficit is narrowing. So there are three reasons. The Indian economy is not as exposed to external shocks as the rest. The rising exports have helped, and India has a narrowing current account deficit. What's a current account deficit? It's the difference between a government's expenses and earnings. Let me rephrase this. India is doing better because of immunity to external shocks, expanding exports, and reducing deficits. And the numbers support this assessment. Last month, India's exports crossed the 750 billion mark. This was an all-time high. Inflation is slowly coming under control. In February, inflation in India fell below the 7% mark. This year's monsoon predictions are out. Forecasters say India will have a normal monsoon this year. This is expected to boost food grain output and ease concerns of any shortage. Since the pandemic began, the Indian economy has performed better than the rest. The challenge now is to sustain this growth, to keep it at the same level. And it won't be easy because while India can resist some of the external shocks, it cannot avoid them altogether. And there will be external shocks. The IMF says the outlook for the world economy remains dim.
We have a global slowdown in growth, not just for advanced economies, but also for emerging market and developing economies. We are in a situation where there is elevated levels of nervousness in the market. There are a number of vulnerabilities out there, and one should be very vigilant going ahead to try to make sure that the places that look weak are reinforced or buttressed and or taking actions to reduce these vulnerabilities.
What are these vulnerabilities? High inflation, rising interest rates, the uncertainty in the global banking sector, which was triggered by the bank failures in the US, and the war in Ukraine. It has cast a shadow on the economy. Policymakers and investors are nervous. The war is far from over, and there's a fear that it may spill over. There are growing geopolitical tensions over Ukraine, so the global economic situation remains challenging, and India's policy planners have their task cut out. They must create new opportunities and contain the risks. Right now, India's finance minister is in Washington. Nirmala Sitharaman is leading a high-powered delegation and meeting top officials. Yesterday, she met with Geeta Gopinath, the deputy managing director of IMF. They discussed global economic challenges. Sitharaman also met Janet Yellen, the US Treasury Secretary, their finance minister. India is pushing for reforms of multilateral development banks, like the World Bank. Yellen has appreciated India's stance on the issue. The next few months are going to be crucial. As the world's fastest growing economy, there will be more expectations from India, and New Delhi will have to go beyond expressing opinion. It will have to come up with solutions to some of the most pressing challenges of the world today. From an emerging leader to a leader in crisis, the President of France, Emmanuel Macron. His ratings in France are near a record low. But now he wants to lead the European Union. And in the process, he's turning into Europe's greatest embarrassment. Yesterday, he was in the Netherlands. Macron delivered yet another speech. He was heckled. Protesters openly challenged the French president. And the entire affair was caught on camera. Take a look at this.
I do admire Nexus Institute, what you do and how much you delivered such strong messages, not just for Europe, but for humanity and our common values. Hello.
I think we lost something. Where is French democracy?
Where did we lost it?
Where did we lost it?
I can answer this question if you give me some time.
French demonstrants of the social and the environmental movement. Or maybe when you bypass again French Parliament.
Nobody listens. You have millions of people in the streets.
So the people shouted him down. His voice was drowned. And he could make himself heard only after the protesters were removed. Who were these protesters? Who were the people who were heckling Macron? Mostly students. They came with banners. One of them said this: "President of violence and hypocrisy." Macron seemed unfazed. Once the protesters were removed, he continued with a straight face.
And a democracy is exactly a place where you can demonstrate, you can have, as in your country, this type of interventions.
It's a good try, but it did not help. He's under fire for his comments on China and Taiwan. Last week, the French president was in China. He got a grand reception in Beijing. This week, he's in the Netherlands with more pomp and pageantry. Macron met the Dutch king. There was a 42-gun salute in his honor and a gala dinner. The French president is on a state visit, the first one for the Netherlands in 23 years. But the people are not half as welcoming. They are protesting. And the people at home are also protesting. For weeks, France has been in turmoil. Macron pushed a controversial pension reform. He raised the age of retirement from 62 to 64. The people of France are up in arms. They want to retire early and get pension benefits. There's an uprising of sorts against the president. There have been violent protests. Macron did not bother with the parliament's consent. He just rammed the policy through. He used special presidential powers to push the reform, and now he's chasing global leadership. His new cause is Europe's independence, strategic independence, a bit like non-alignment. Macron wants Europe to stop leaning on America, to walk the middle path, and to become what he calls the third world power. It's an interesting idea. It also sounds good on paper, you could say. But when Macron tried to articulate it, he sparked a diplomatic crisis. Consider some of his recent statements, and I'm quoting: "Do we Europeans have an interest in speeding up the subject of Taiwan? No. The worst of things would be to think that we Europeans must be followers on this subject and adapt ourselves to an American rhythm and a Chinese overreaction. We will not have the time nor the means to finance our own strategic autonomy, and we will become vassals." Allow me to sum up what Emmanuel Macron tried to say here. He said Europe should not become a vassal state of America, and that it should avoid being drawn into a conflict over Taiwan. These words have led to a backlash. European lawmakers are in a bind. Some of them are trying to distance themselves from Macron. Listen to what one of the European lawmakers had to say, and I'm quoting again. Macron says Europe should, and we Europeans, but he speaks for France. He can't really speak for Europe. And here's what a German lawmaker said. Macron had turned his trip to China into a PR coup for Xi and a foreign policy disaster for Europe. So what really happened here? Macron tried taking a more radical approach. Perhaps he got carried away, and it backfired. Now Paris is trying some damage control. For one of his interviews, the Élysée Palace laid down special conditions. They insisted on checking and proofreading Macron's quotes. This was one of the conditions for the interview. So are they suggesting that he's being misquoted? They haven't said so yet, but they did censor some of his statements. Reports say some quotes on Taiwan were removed from a recent interview. So was Emmanuel Macron censored by his own team? Are they worried that he's going a step too far? Either way, the damage is done. Europe finds itself in an awkward position, and it must pacify its rattled allies. And now let's look at what's happening in the other side of the world. Brazilian President Lula da Silva is visiting China. He was supposed to go in late March, and it was supposed to be a mostly business trip. But Lula fell ill. He was diagnosed with pneumonia. Now that he's recovered, he's going first to Shanghai, then to Beijing. This man is 77 years old. And the fact that he's traveling this far so soon after recovery is significant. China knows it. Here's what they say.
China is willing to work with Brazil to take this visit as an opportunity to promote the upgrading of mutually beneficial and friendly cooperation between the two countries in various fields, and to inject more positive energy, to promote solidarity and cooperation among developing countries, and to jointly address global challenges.
That's a lot to unpack, but let's break it down into two major parts. One, mutually beneficial ties between China and Brazil, and two, jointly addressing global challenges. We'll start with Brazil-China relations. Lula da Silva is visiting Shanghai for an inauguration. The latest head of the New Development Bank is taking charge. This bank, the New Development Bank or the NDB, was formed by BRICS nations in the year 2014. It will now be headed by Dilma Rousseff. She's a former president of Brazil. She took over from Lula as president in the year 2011. And now she's heading the NDB. A key ally of Lula is heading a Shanghai-based bank. And he's attending her inauguration. This is a far cry from the rocky ties that Brasilia and Beijing shared for a while. The last president of Brazil was Jair Bolsonaro. He was a staunchly anti-China leader. He tried to limit trade with China. Lula, in his previous tenures as president, has pushed trade with China. In fact, in 2009, China had overtaken the US as Brazil's top trading partner. China has been investing billions in Brazil, both in infrastructure projects and in setting up businesses. But some of that money dried up during the Bolsonaro years due to his perceived anti-China stance. Now that Lula is back in charge, China-Brazil ties are thawing.
I would like to say that Brazil has returned to the stage of world diplomacy and the center of international relations, which President Lula has paid close attention to since he took office. This visit to China is undoubtedly an important step towards rebuilding the friendly relations between the two countries. Of course, we will all defend our respective interests, but by working together, we hope to seek more development for the two peoples.
And now the yuan is flowing into Brazil, literally. The two countries recently agreed to trade in their local currencies. They're bypassing the US dollar. Does this mean that Lula has shifted Brazil's allegiance to China and that he's spurning the US? It's not as simple as that. Brazil is playing a delicate balancing game. As tensions continue to rise between the US and China, the US is still Brazil's second largest trading partner. Lula has to keep Washington happy. And that explains why his first state visit after becoming president was to the US. But these are polarized times, and a balanced approach is not appreciated in times like these. Yet Lula wants a global role for himself. So he weighed in on the war in Ukraine. This is what he said.
What does Putin want? Putin can't keep Ukraine's territory. Maybe we don't even discuss Crimea, but we'll have to rethink about what he has invaded. Also, Zelensky can't want everything he wants to demand. NATO will not be able to set itself up at the border. So, this is something we have to put on the table.
He suggests the middle path, and he's found no takers. Ukraine, of course, has rejected any compromise on Crimea, and Russia seems unlikely to accept a diplomatic end to the war. Which brings us to our second point, Brazil and China trying to jointly address international challenges. Xi Jinping has already proposed a peace plan. And Lula da Silva says the Chinese president is the best person to mediate in Ukraine.
I am convinced both Russia and Ukraine are waiting for somebody to come and tell them to sit down and talk. Why do I want to talk to Xi Jinping? Because I think China's economic importance, China's military importance, China's political importance, and China's relationship with Russia, even China's divergence with the US, gives China an extraordinary power to dialogue.
So Lula believes that China still has a role to play, even though their peace plan was a damp squib. And it's not just China that Lula is propping up. He has a list of potential mediators, including India.
China has weight, Brazil has weight. I think Indonesia can participate. I think India can participate. Let's talk to Putin. Let's talk to Zelensky. Let's talk to Biden. Let's see if we can find a group of people that disagree with the war.
Lula's approach seems to favor a multipolar world, a world where emerging economies play a role in global diplomacy, where the world is not held hostage to the schemes of great powers. It sounds admirable, but is his choice of ally in China really the way to go about this? Because remember, as we've seen all too often, a deal with China rarely comes without strings attached. And now let's talk about ties between India and Ukraine. They haven't been great, especially lately, particularly since Russia began the war. Why? Because India has not completely rallied behind Ukraine. And don't get me wrong, New Delhi is not supporting the brutal war. Prime Minister Narendra Modi told Russian President Putin that this is not the era for war. India is pushing for a diplomatic solution. But Kiev has been critical of India. Listen to what their foreign minister said just a few months ago.
You can enjoy the benefit of buying cheap Russian oil because someone in Ukraine is dying because of the Russian aggression.
They're upset because India buys Russian oil. Ukraine says India is bankrolling the Russian war machine. Never mind the fact that India must look after its own economic interests, or that Europe was buying oil and more from Russia. The numbers speak for themselves. Ukraine's criticism was reserved only for India. It offered moral lectures for months on end. Now suddenly the tone has changed. Ukraine says it is in no position to instruct India, and it's seeking humanitarian aid. So what happened? Is it a change of heart or a change of circumstances? There's no doubt that Ukraine needs help. It is not making gains on the battlefield. This week, their deputy foreign minister is in India. Her name is Amin Zaparova. She's on a 4-day official visit and seems to have come with an olive branch and an agenda. Listen to what she said on Monday.
I think that India, as a global player, really is a Vishwaguru of the world. And this is what we also feel in Ukraine by actually fighting for the values. This is about justice.
Vishwaguru. It roughly translates to global teacher or guide. It's what India aims to be. So unless she's mocking India, this was high praise coming from Ukraine. And a stark departure from the comments of her boss, Ukraine's foreign minister, Dmitry Kuleba. He slammed India and India's External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar for reminding the world that Europe too buys Russian oil. He said the oil India buys from Russia contains the blood of Ukrainians. So why is his deputy doing this about turn? Because Ukraine wants something. Two somethings actually. One relates to the upcoming G20 summit in India.
Ukrainian agenda is something that impacts the whole world because it's a litmus paper that shows all of the drawbacks and flaws of the international system and incapability to protect sovereign countries whenever it's attacked by a stronger one. So I think that India may take also this leadership by involving and engaging Ukrainian agenda into discussions that would take place at the side events or sidelines or the events dedicated to the G20 or within summits of G20.
Zelensky wants to speak at the G20 meeting that will be held in India in the month of September, like he did last year when Indonesia hosted the summit in Bali. But India may have other plans. New Delhi has not publicly spoken about Zelensky's request. Reports say India wants to focus on global economic challenges, and it doesn't want the meeting to be hijacked by Ukraine. It happened the last time, with the West on one side and Russia and China on the other. So this time, Zelensky may not get a global platform. What's the second thing that Kiev wants from New Delhi? Symbolic visits, apparently. Ukraine wants Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi to visit the country, to take a walk through the capital like his European counterparts keep doing. The wish may not be granted, given India's ties with Russia. These ties go back to the old Soviet Union days, so an Indian Prime Minister visiting Ukraine at this time sounds like a pipe dream, and Kiev probably realizes this too, so it has proposed another name.
Ukrainian people are now experts in international relations. They closely watch the comments of different leaders, as well as the Prime Minister Modi, the travels of the National Security Advisor, Mr. Doval, and when he 3 times go to Moscow, of course, it's a matter of question if he would come to Kiev, and we also will be happy to welcome leaders and officials of India in Kiev, just to balance and just to kind of demonstrate a pragmatic approach.
Ukraine says it wants India's National Security Advisor Ajit Doval to visit as a sign of balance. It's a strange request, but then again, the war has shown that optics matter. New Delhi will have to take a call on whether this makes sense for India. There are other requests that Kiev has made, like more Indian medical supplies and the kind of stuff that Foreign Minister Kuleba does not talk about when he targets India. India has been providing Ukraine with medicines and medical equipment since the war began. This is a show of solidarity for those affected by the violence. It's a humanitarian form of support. There's also a letter from President Zelensky addressed to Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Its contents have not been made public yet, but it's reportedly a request for more aid from India. And all of this marks a shift in the stance of Kiev. Pushed to the wall, it is working to mend ties with India instead of being confrontational. It's a step in the right direction, of course. We're waiting to see how India responds. Now let's turn our attention to Myanmar, formerly known as Burma. It's a Southeast Asian nation home to about 53 million people and more than 100 ethnic groups. It became independent in 1948, and since then, for decades, it has suffered repressive military rule, widespread poverty and civil wars. This country is no stranger to bloodshed, and this week it saw another deadly attack, the worst since the coup. You know, the coup when the military took power in 2021. They overthrew the elected government of Aung San Suu Kyi. She's a Nobel laureate. She's currently in jail. She's serving a 33-year sentence. Her supporters say this is a conspiracy to keep her out of politics. The military says it will hold elections soon, but it has missed its own deadlines. Since the coup, more than 3,000 civilians have been killed. The generals face widespread opposition. They try to quell it with lethal force. They launch airstrikes against their own people. Many of the opponents are armed. So there are violent conflicts between the junta, the military rulers, and the rebels. Yesterday, there was a deadly attack. The military carried out airstrikes. At least 100 people are said to have been killed, 30 of them reportedly children. This happened in the Sagaing region in the northwest. Some 150 people had gathered there for a ceremony. The opposition movement, the rebels, they were opening a local office. So obviously, most of the people attending were rebels, those opposed to the military rule. The junta decided to strike them. They sent a fighter jet. It dropped bombs on the crowd. Many people were killed. Some survived with injuries. But not for long. Because half an hour later, they were attacked again, and this happened while the wounded were being transported. A helicopter fired at the site. Witnesses say people were blown to pieces. Dead bodies were heaped on the ground. The office building was destroyed by a fire. The scene of horror was engulfed in thick smoke. Myanmar's junta has taken full responsibility for yesterday's attack. In fact, they've tried to justify it. They said this action was necessary to tackle anti-government forces. And they accused the rebels of carrying out a violent campaign of terror.
Yes, of course. We had launched the attack on them. We were informed that the People's Defense Force were killed at the event under the attack. They are opposing our government.
The junta has repeatedly made this charge. They accuse pro-democracy forces of terrorism. They say such forces terrorize and kill civilians, while the military seeks peace. Experts say there is enough evidence to prove otherwise. They report large-scale human rights abuses by the army. Myanmar's military has reportedly burnt down entire villages, forced the displacement of more than 1 million people, blocked humanitarian aid, targeted schools, homes and hospitals, detained at least 17,000 anti-coup protesters, and needless to say, repeatedly attacked the opposition. So while yesterday's attack is horrific, it wasn't a first. Similar attacks have happened in the past. The world has condemned it. Critics say there should be a ban on the sale of aviation fuel to Myanmar. This will cripple the army's air power. Many Western nations have also imposed arms embargoes. The US and the UK recently slapped new sanctions. They target companies involved in supplying jet fuel to Myanmar. But it's not making a lot of difference, evidently. The junta continues to benefit from a haphazard international response.
We can't just sort of sit back and hope that something will get better. The international community, continues to issue these statements. But, the Myanmar people have already figured out that if it's just a statement that's coming out, it's not going to mean anything. There needs to be concrete action. And ideally, this will reinvigorate the effort to try to press for an international arms embargo against the Myanmar junta.
As Myanmar awaits change, the violence and body count is only rising. Atrocities increase whenever the junta comes under pressure. Because for this government of Myanmar, the people are the enemies. To the UK now, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is in Northern Ireland. He's hosting US President Biden in Belfast. It's a very short visit, not even a full day. Northern Ireland is a conflicted region. It saw 30 years of violence. Then a peace accord was signed some 25 years ago. It's called the Good Friday Agreement. Biden has come to mark the anniversary of this agreement and to hail its quote-unquote tremendous progress. But Northern Ireland remains conflicted. Brexit is unraveling the delicate peace, and Rishi Sunak has his plate full. When he comes back to London, he'll have to deal with another crisis. The rising cost of living is pushing people to the edge. They say costs are high and wages are low. Doctors say they're among the worst hit, and now they've gone on a strike. It's expected to cause unprecedented disruption. Here's a report.
350,000. That's how many appointments and operations are expected to get postponed in the UK. That's over 250,000 patients having their treatment put off to a later date. And this is happening because junior doctors across Britain are on strike. It began on Tuesday and will go on till Saturday. Tens of thousands of doctors are on strike. Just to give you an idea of how significant this is, junior doctors make up about half the medical workforce in the UK. They're not coming to work. Their demand is pretty simple. They want a 35% pay hike.
26% less.
It's quite a lot to ask for, but these doctors argue that they have suffered a 26% pay cut over the past 15 years. The British government has called their demand unrealistic. It says such a pay hike would mean some junior doctors getting more than £20,000 in additional pay, and Britain can't afford that.
So we are ready to have discussions with them, but clearly a demand for 35%, over £20,000 for some junior doctors is not fair or reasonable, and that is why we've not been able to make progress so far. But we want to engage constructively.
That was the British Health Secretary. Remember, the strike coincides with the Easter school holidays, Ramzan, and the Jewish festival of Passover. Also, this is the biggest industrial strike in the history of the British National Health Service. According to the Health Secretary, the strike poses a considerable risk to patient safety. But that's not where he stopped. He went on to accuse the doctors of maintaining a militant stance in negotiations. The doctors obviously have a different take on the matter. According to the British Medical Association, junior doctors earn just over £14 an hour, but the pressure on them is only increasing. Patient waiting lists and the workload is at record highs. Couple that with the cost of living crisis and double-digit inflation, and doctors are failing to make ends meet. Many of them are victims of depression and mental distress.
I mean, I'm only 4 years post-graduation, but there's already been suicides from my graduating class. I've got friends who've left medicine because it's broken them. I had to have counselling for PTSD symptoms after the COVID pandemic because it was a horror, and we're still expected to carry on as though nothing's happened, and deteriorating conditions, and it's getting to the point where we're all at breaking point, not just financially but mentally and physically. We just can't go on like this.
Our doctors are leaving to Australia, Canada, New Zealand, other industries where they feel they can provide better care and they can have their salary doubled. We're not asking for that. All we're asking for is to get back to net neutral, just back to 2008 levels where the service ran more efficiently, when the waiting list was a third of what it was today, and when doctors were being paid a slightly more appropriate wage.
Strikes in the UK have now become a regular affair. Over the past couple of months, industrial strikes and picketing has hit nearly all sectors of the British economy. Nurses, teachers, university staff, train and bus drivers, civil servants, security guards, they have all taken part in strikes. Their demands are basically the same: better wages. Inflation is slowing, albeit at a snail's pace, so workers need immediate increments in pay to adjust to the new reality of life in the UK, one where they need more money to survive. But the UK's economy is shrinking. In fact, it will be the worst performing G7 economy this year. so London does not have the fiscal legroom to hike wages. And yet, the workers remain adamant. It'll be interesting to see how Prime Minister Rishi Sunak navigates through this crisis.
Iran, Russia and China have joined forces. They're working on creating a new security nightmare for the US. Tehran wants to build new ballistic missiles, but it's missing an important component, a chemical compound that is used to make missiles. Now, reports say China and Russia have agreed to help out. They want to help Iran. They've held secret talks with Tehran, and they could supply the chemical compound to Iran, the one that it needs. Which chemical are we talking about? It's called ammonium perchlorate, or AP for short. It's one of the main ingredients used to power missiles. Now, Iran cannot source this compound because of international sanctions. They've cut off Iran's supply. Now, help may be on the way. Reports say Tehran is in talks both with Beijing and Moscow. The name of a Russian company is also doing the rounds. It's called FKP Anozit. This is a state-owned maker of chemicals, but we cannot confirm if this company will supply to Iran. What we do know is how this chemical may be used. With sufficient quantities of AP, Iran should be able to build thousands of rockets. This includes the Zolfaghar missile. It has a range of 700 kilometers. Iran and its proxies have been using this missile in West Asia. It's an effective weapon. As of today, Iran does not have enough of these missiles. But when it does, it will pose a new security challenge for the West. The immediate threat will be in Ukraine. Iran has been supplying drones to Russia. Reports say Moscow could consider deploying the Zolfaghar missile against Ukraine. Moscow and Tehran are already trashing Western sanctions. Let me give you an example. Russia's largest carrier, Aeroflot, wanted a plane to be repaired, an Airbus A330-300. But Western sanctions came in the way. They've blocked Russia's access to Western aircraft maintenance and parts. Russia cannot access those. Enter Iran. It is happy to help Aeroflot. Iranian airline Mahan Air will repair the Russian plane. This is what Aeroflot has said. It says, Mahan Air has the necessary equipment and facilities, certificates and vast experience for this repair. And that's not all. Russia is also sending Iran oil supplies. They're using trains for this. In the last 2 months, Moscow has supplied 30,000 tons of gasoline and diesel to Iran. This was sent via trains. The export was routed through Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. And you must be wondering, Iran itself is a major exporter of oil. Why is Iran getting diesel from Russia? Because Iran is consuming more than what it can produce at this point. Reports say Iran needs fuel for energy generation and for the production of petrochemicals. Both production facilities need natural gas and diesel. Apparently, Iran is facing a serious shortage of both. And going by one claim, Iran's daily gasoline consumption has touched 144 million liters. This is 50% higher than Iran's average daily consumption. So it has ramped up production. But most of this supply is being exported. Iran wants to keep its economy afloat, so it needs the Russian imports. Moscow and Tehran have a swap agreement in place. It works like a barter system. Both sides exchange oil and gas instead of cash. Remember, both Iran and Russia face Western sanctions for ways to expand trade by circumventing sanctions. And a barter is a good way to do that. Another option is to avoid the US dollar. Iran and Russia are now trading in their own currencies. Moscow and Tehran have signed agreements. Besides trading in their own currencies, they are willing to integrate their banking systems. Russia's system is called Mir, and Iran has something called the Shatters banking system. Once they're integrated, these banks in both the countries will be able to work together. They'll be able to conduct transactions seamlessly. You know, the West was hoping to contain this, but they're unwittingly pushing Russia and Iran closer to each other. And China's support will strengthen this partnership. The bad news from West Asia keeps piling on for the US. Meanwhile, the war continues to hurt people across the world. In Kenya, there's an economic crisis. People are dealing with soaring inflation and a high cost of living. The government is failing to tackle it. Now they've run out of cash. Kenya does not have money to pay the salaries of government employees. There is a major cash crisis in the country, also a public debt crisis. The government borrowed money left, right, and center, so debt has soared, and so has the interest on debt. It has touched $5 billion per year, $5 billion in interest payments on domestic debt. It is 5 times what it was a decade ago. Here's a report. Kenya's future looks bleak. It is facing one of the worst economic crises. It's been hit hard by a cost of living crisis. Food prices have risen by almost 16% within a year. People are unemployed and hungry. There is growing anger. And on top of this, now there's a major cash crisis in Kenya. It means exactly what it's called. Kenya does not have enough money available. So it can't do the things it usually does, like pay salaries. Public sector employees are not being paid their dues. Civil servants, including lawmakers, did not receive pay last month. Other government workers have gone 3 months without theirs. The impact has been worse in rural areas. Experts say there are fears of major social upheaval. Threats of potential workers' strikes have been made. Notifications of boycotting work have been shared. If this happens, the country may come to a standstill, and Kenya cannot afford this. Because delay in salary payments is not Kenya's only problem. And not just the workers, county governments are broke too. They haven't received money from the centre. So health and education spendings have taken a hit. But the government does not seem too worried, which is perplexing. Presidential Economic Advisor David Nadi says he has good reason. He says workers will begin receiving their salaries soon, probably by the end of the week. He blamed the cash crisis on bad timing and low revenue streams, meaning there aren't enough sources to bring money in the country. He says the situation will improve soon, which is something the government has been saying for a while now. But the crisis has been worsening. Last month, the government paid off some interest on external debts, so it was left with less cash in hand. There is also growing public debt, $72 billion of it, and a cost of living crisis. Annual inflation was 9.2% in March, well above the central bank's target. This led to weeks of protests in the country. And all this as the Kenyan shilling weakens. Its exchange rate is tanking to historic lows. This has pushed up the cost of imports. About 6 million people are suffering acute food shortage. All in all, the situation is dire. But yes, one can call it bad timing. Kenya's economy is racing towards a cliff and racing against time. 2024 could be a crunch point. There is strong and ongoing support from the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The country has a $2 billion euro bond, but it expires next year. It needs repaying. Kenya is trying to come out of this. If redeemed successfully, pressures can ease for Kenyans. But the government is not sure when the cash crunch will be resolved. And the people are not sure if the government is doing enough to resolve it. Because the economic pain is intensifying, Kenya resembles a loaded but slow-motion train wreck. Coming out of this will not be easy. I'm sure you've heard about Super Mario, one of the most popular video games in the world, also one of the oldest. It's been around since 1985. And now it's on track to becoming one of the most popular films too. Super Mario was released earlier this month. It has shattered box office records and beaten all expectations. And this is spectacular because the last film with the same name was a big flop, a colossal disaster, both in terms of reviews and revenue. This was about 3 decades ago. The film did so badly that for 30 years, nobody dared to make a Super Mario film. But now they have, and the iconic plumber is back with a bang. Our next report tells you why this may have worked.
Super Mario's Mushroom Kingdom has fascinated people for the past 3 decades. Mario is the main character. In the world of games, he's called the play character. He's joined by his brother Luigi to save Princess Peach, who keeps getting kidnapped by the antagonist called Bowser. Over the long Easter weekend, here's how much the film made at the box office. $204.6 million in the US and $337 million worldwide. So, Super Mario Bros. Clocked a thunderous $541 million debut in just 3 days. The year is 1993. Hollywood makes its first big-budget video game adaptation film. Guess what the movie was called? Super Mario Bros. But the film tanked. It earned just about $21 million, almost half of what it took to make the movie. There are several reasons why that film didn't work, but the one that released last week made history. For starters, a man called Shigeru Miyamoto was involved in the production of the latest Super Mario film. He's the man who created the Super Mario game universe. The creators of the first Super Mario film got too experimental. They largely shot the film in an abandoned cement factory. The 1993 film was set in a dystopian alternative, one which had no resemblance to the colorful Mushroom Kingdom people had gotten so used to. The film looked nothing like the game. Perhaps that was the idea. The film's tagline was this ain't no game. An ill-thought slogan which cost the filmmakers a lot. After all, audiences wanted the film to be just like the game back then too. And the reason why this year's film has beaten records is because it retains its game-esque features. The previous film's script had problems too. It wasn't powerful and convincing enough, and there were problems with production as well. So while the 30-year-old film had obvious problems in its marketing campaign, the makers of the latest Super Mario Bros. Got Universal Pictures as their distributor. And Universal Pictures is a behemoth. A behemoth that left no stone unturned to market the film. Partnerships with restaurant chains like McDonald's, sports championships, popular talk shows, you name it. But the most significant achievement of the film is this. It has shattered the belief that video game adaptations don't work. Especially adaptations of the Super Mario universe.
And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. We're starting with the US. A major wildfire broke out in New Jersey. Only about 10% of the fire has been contained. In Colombia, a volcano is on the verge of erupting. Authorities say the volcano is unstable and there is an increased seismic activity. Parts of Syria are flooded. It is getting difficult for children to reach their schools. And now, what makes April the 12th a significant day? Let's take you back in history. On this day, the first ever human went to space. The year was 1961. Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit the Earth. The flight lasted 108 minutes. With this, the era of human space flight began, and the Soviet Union beat the US to it. We're leaving you with this. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.